Please take a seat. So, what we're going to do here is sit wherever you fancy. So this is about trying to go kind of slightly deep into an issue, but we're going to start off with a question, a Slido question to all of you, and so that we're going to ask you, to respond to this question, and then we'll kind of use that as the basis for a broader conversation with my very dear colleague friend here, who's joined us. We had two contributors, but one has sadly had to drop out for at the last minute. But let's put up the question first. Colleagues. There you go. That's the question. Leaders in Europe are underestimating how much the green transition depends on critical raw materials and geopolitics. So are they underestimating the transition depends on critical raw materials and geopolitics? So go for it, download it. Either people are switching between different areas, or it's just taking time to fill in. Interesting-ish. Those of you, if you're brave enough to sort of put your hand up and say, who are you that somewhat disagrees and why? There you go. Can I have a mic, please?
Hi, thank you.
Your name?
Yes, I was one of the few who chose that, I guess.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. My name is Mayra Buenaventura. I am from Microsoft Government Affairs, working on sustainability topics. And my assessment was, yes, they might be underestimating the big picture, but the fact that first we have a Critical Raw Materials Act that was approved on the last mandate, and the fact that we are, as in we, I mean in European leaders, that they are trying to get these trade deals in, for example, Mercosur or also with the US, showcases that even if they do it wrong, they know the problem is there.
So that fills you with confidence. Actually, it wasn't a question of confidence.
Not
so
really,
it's
no.
Okay. That was me being really bad. Who else in that category that felt, please?
Thanks very much. Emily Stewart from Global Witness. I think something in the same direction, really, is that we have seen a lot of policies, and perhaps I'm taking this question too literally. I don't think they're underestimating how much the green transition depends on the raw materials, but maybe if I could split that out, possibly underestimating how much it does depend on geopolitics, or rather underestimating some of the other blocks in the world, and also maybe the autonomy of a lot of the resource-rich regions. I think that some of the strategic projects that we've seen springing up outside of the EU, with very little detail about what those actually contain, maybe speak to this idea that we don't quite that we're maybe underestimating a little bit that some of these regions have other choices than the EU, and we need to have a strong offer on the table.
Well, and good to have Global Witness in the room. Thank you for being here amongst all of you, of the others as well. Who is it that feels on the kind of top, somewhat agree or strongly agree? Because we've had two, and I have to say, younger bits of the generation coming out in the way that you have. There you go. Another relatively young person here as well. Anybody else? somewhat, whether you actually somewhat agree or strongly agree. Okay, go on. Please introduce yourself.
Raphaël Danglade from the Africa Europe Foundation. We've been working on critical raw materials, which we call transition minerals, because they are critical for the EU, but not always for Africa. And the reality is that the EU, despite having indeed some of its policies in place when it comes to the EU Critical Raw Material Act and the very ambitious targets that it has set for itself for 2030, it seems that none of these are achievable. And despite having signed a number of strategic partnerships with Africa, including a number of South African development community countries such as Zambia, Namibia, DRC, Rwanda, and also countries as part of the Lobito corridor, there is very little investment from the EU that goes into that space. And so you wonder, what is the EU truly doing to activate these strategic partnerships or to activate some of the strategic projects that have been identified under the EU CRMA outside of the EU? There are a number of countries that are affected or that are in the mix of these strategic projects, such as Madagascar, Malawi, South Africa, Zambia. But when it comes to the EU mobilizing its finance to ensure that it will secure its supply to accelerate its transition, whether it is green, digital, or its defense transition, we see very little investment in that space.
Raphael, what's that about from your perspective? Because if you've been to the debate just now, right, there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense that we need to make choices, and the fact that we need to think about alternative partners. Africa is a pure choice in that regard in terms of what you could do. What's your reaction to that? Why do you think?
I think that unfortunately today the EU is still too hesitant to secure strategic partnerships and activate its strategic partnerships.
In
Africa. Mostly in Africa.
Would you specify Africa?
Despite Africa having 40% of minerals that we need for these types of transition, the EU is not taking the risk yet to invest sufficiently. And I'm happy to see that the EIB, of course, is a partner to this event, because I understand that the EIB is also looking into this to understand how it can take the first risk. So very much looking forward to work with the EIB on this to make sure that indeed these strategic partnerships, these strategic projects can be activated and financed.
I mean, there's a kind of a duh moment that when you think about what's going on in the United States, that, Asia and Africa ought to be the natural partners and the fourth, long-term partners for Europe's trajectory of success. But thank you for raising that. Anybody else? I can kind of walk to the back here. You guys are being a bit quiet. I know there's a lot of people in the front, easily. So I'm walking towards you to make you feel more at home. Are there any of you who want to raise a voice? Excellent. Can I have a mic here? Say who you are.
My name is Matija Kajic from Triodos Investment Management. I was hoping to speak before getting picked on, but I guess the opportunity arose now. My colleague spoke that he strongly agrees with the statement from this geopolitical perspective and the need for the European Union to form partnerships. But I also think that there's more the European Union could do with its own policies to show that it's aware of this dependence on critical raw materials. So yes, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act, but do we have the policies on, for example, mandatory recycling requirements so that we are not so dependent on virgin critical raw materials? Do we have an avoidance of any loopholes in right to repair, really stimulating more of those policies that will actually lower our dependence for...
Which is fairly straightforward, right? You'd have thought. What's the problem here? Is it basically head in the sand?
I don't know if it's head in the sand or that we kind of have not, the colleagues in the earlier panel spoke about the fact that we need to think about what technologies we want to prioritize, but we also think we need to think about what technologies the European Union does not want to prioritize. So phase out plans for certain materials that will then create room for other materials, for recycled materials, and so forth.
Okay. And last but not least, yes.
Thank you. My name is Peter Bocek. I'm with the European chemical industry. And I can only confirm that the awareness of the dependency of Europe on its sources is rather low with policymakers as well as with the public. With chemicals, I can tell you that we use the Commission methodology how to determine what is a critical raw material, and we found that quite huge amount of the traded chemicals, Europe is actually highly dependent on very few suppliers, very often one supplier. And that is also a result of economic decisions of companies. And that's also where I see the solution. Companies need to really reflect how can they broaden their supply base and where are the risks. And that is maybe not always a room for politics and Europe to solve that. It's also a responsibility of companies themselves.
And do you believe the the chemical industry is, I suppose it's Turkey's voting for Christmas, but are you doing enough R&D to make the transition, do you feel, from your perspective?
I think we could do more, for sure. And also, I think the politics could do more, like recycling, a definition of waste and so on. There's a lot of things that still can be done to broaden the supply base or also secure what is inside Europe, that it doesn't leave Europe anymore.
Thank you. That's it. I hope you found that useful. What better than to have, the World Resources Institute represented here in the context of this conversation? Okay, do you want to respond to what you saw on, in terms of that question, but also the kind of the issues that people have raised? What's your what's your take on where people are coming from, but also from the Institute's point of view, what do we need to do better and differently?
Yeah, sure. Maybe first I'll just say a couple of words about myself, because this is an event about Europe, and neither my face nor my name look very European. So I was born and grew up in China. I studied in the US, and I've been living in Europe for 18 years, almost 2 decades. So I do consider myself a friend of Europe. And I also sincerely want to see Europe continue to be such a great place to live. But unlike all of you who are European affairs experts, I'm not, but I hope I can contribute to the discussion with a bit more international perspective. So coming back to the poll question, I think there's a time dimension here. If we go back 10 years, maybe even 5 years, I would strongly agree, because back then we were all still celebrating the fruits of globalization, right? The price of solar panels and batteries dropped by 10 times between year 2000 and 2018. And that made the clean energy transition affordable. But in more recent years, everybody gets shaken by the geopolitical earthquakes. And I think, actually, I agree with some of the speakers, opinions here. I think EU reacted quite swiftly. The Critical Raw Materials Act got passed with record speed. And EU also has been a policy leader on circular economy, right? EU had a circular economy action plan back in 2015. So EU has been reacting politically. I think actually the risk maybe now the pendulum swings too far to the other end, and it may backfire on the clean energy transition itself, right? So we need to find a new balance.
In terms of your view from the Institute, in terms of the issues that we raised, what role do you think, what could governments, what could the EU be doing differently and better now? You said, before, we both, when you think about the trajectory of growth for China and the EU, the destinies on the future was linked because it led to prosperity for both. But we're in a different geopolitical environment. So what's your take on how we navigate this geopolitical environment for critical raw materials? And given the point that was made by the colleague from the African Foundation.
Yeah. So there's clearly a global race for these critical minerals. And I think it's not about only the minerals, because what do you do with all the minerals if you don't have downstream industry to make them into products? So it's really a redistribution of the whole supply chain. And I think, as the previous panel already discussed quite a bit, I think EU needs to first decide what will success look like. Will success be that Europe become fully self-sufficient in the supply chain? Or does success look like, does EU want to lead on part of the supply chain? There was a lot of discussion saying, okay, it probably does not make sense for EU to rebuild a full supply chain from scratch and compete with a very mature supply chain already in Asia. And it's not just Europe, right? Now, every country, every mineral producing country, including Indonesia, including Zambia and the DRC, want to build a full battery supply chain. So the entire world is trying to enter this game. Does it make sense for EU to enter this game for today's clean tech, right? Like the CRM, the Critical Raw Materials Act, is trying to reintroduce mining projects in Europe. And it's very difficult. But suppose Europe succeed in overcoming the obstacles of financing, of public resistance. And in 10 years from now, because that's at least how long it's going to take, in 10 years from now, these mines will start producing minerals. What we know for sure is that technology would have moved on by then, right? We've seen it took only a few years for battery chemistry to change fundamentally. So by then, what will Europe do with all these minerals, which are critical today, but they may not be critical tomorrow? Should Europe start instead anticipating what's coming up next and start getting a head start on planning its position and competitiveness for tomorrow? So I think all these are strategic questions that needs to be taken. So we talked a lot about short-term actions.
What should happen in the short term? Okay?
It's needed. I think short-term is more a reactive kind of a crisis management, looking at what is most urgent, right? But Europe do need long-term and independent thinking, right? Because Europe is facing over-dependency on a lot of things, on materials, on energies, on security. And with all the geopolitical turmoil, it's very tough for Europe, but it also provides a moment for Europe to really think independently. What are the core strengths of Europe and how to leverage on that? And amongst all the external risks, potential risks, which ones are more real and more urgent and needs to be tackled first? So to I think, Christoph's point early on, it's about prioritize, right? To pick the battle and sequence it.
Very wise. In the last 5 minutes, I want you to share with us, where do you think innovation is happening in the space currently, right? That Europe might be able to then learn from as it tries to unravel this kind of crisis of dependencies and having to think. But the leadership question for every leader is balancing the short with the medium term. We've not been very good at that. So where's innovation happening?
I think the other panelist, Tavi, will probably be better positioned to really deep dive into innovation. But innovation in the critical mineral space is happening on many fronts, on both the supply side, right? So supply side, there's AI and the machine learning enhanced exploration of minerals. Exploration typically takes many, many years. But with AI support, it can go much faster in identifying where those deposits are. Right. So, and there's also a lot of innovation happening in how to make mining more responsible, because mining is very polluting. It's a dirty business. But there are technology innovations available to reduce the energy consumption, the water consumption, and the waste volume from mining. Direct lithium extraction is one example, right? Instead of having to evaporate, which is very, very water intensive, and lithium often happens in water stressed regions already. There are techniques to improve these practices. And then on the circularity side, on the demand side, there's also a lot of innovation. So from substitution, so we talked about battery chemistry, is shifting away from many of the critical minerals such as cobalt and nickel. There's also a lot. Europe is very good at recycling and sorting technology innovation. There's a lot of experience in that. And Europe is also starting to innovate on the eco-design part. I was just reading this morning that Stellantis has made an innovation in battery design, which will make the batteries easier to reuse and recycle. So when they reach the end of life in mobility, they can be reused for stationary storage applications, right? So these are, I think, in the circular economy area, Europe has a strong record. And the question is how to turn early stage innovations to scale and impact and the competitive advantage.
Thank you. And, we've heard from our colleague, I'm not sure whether she's still here, who I rudely called the cement lady. I think she's left as a result. I do apologize. Forgive me. What's your sense in the last couple of minutes? You're the World Institute on the resources. When you think about what's happening right now, because you're able to take a global view, what's the kind of the meta trend or rather current trend that's most worrying you?
Thank you for that question. I think what's mostly worrying me is that everybody is racing to get minerals fast. And we almost forget why we need these minerals to start with. If these are needed for the clean transition, this whole supply chain needs to be clean as well, right? It doesn't make sense to have a clean technology made with dirty minerals that cause deforestation and the pollution. But I see the tension is increasing between these two. Both Europe and the US wants to drastically shorten the permitting process. Right? It usually takes 10 years to get a mining process. That is very long. Europe is trying to do that in 27 months. And the US federal government is trying to do that in 28 days. And I think that raises concern of how environmental and social safeguarding can be ensured if the permitting time is so drastically reduced. But I'm also conscious, coming from a nonprofit, that the other end of the spectrum is that we pursue perfect sustainability and nothing gets done.
Exactly.
Right? So I think we need a balance between the two. And from WI, we believe such a balance is possible by combining responsible mining practices and scaling circular economy. The technical solutions are there, but we need the policymakers and we need the market to create the right incentives to mainstream them.
Indeed, and very wise words again. And that's like, it's a salutary point where, there's the kind of the greed factor. Let's just rush where we can make the money and not think about it and go for 28 days. But as you say, the mining stuff, it's not going to bear result or fruit for at least half a decade or more. And it's that point you make is that perhaps it's time to pause and think about what is going to be gained by acting fast now, but not buckle ourselves or, have albatrosses around our neck because we've not thought about the wider consequences. If there was one word of advice you'd give to the EU, what would it be on critical raw materials? Or have you already said it? I mean, what would be that one? Imagine you've got the college, Team Europe in front of you. What would you say to them?
I would say independent thinking. It does not mean independence in everything tomorrow. It's think independently of what Europe really wants.